Welcome back to Go Ask a Nurse, where professionals who care share the truth behind healthcare. I'm your host, Anna Marie, a registered nurse, a master's of nursing, with a passion for educating, empowering, and inspiring others to take charge of their health. Today, we're diving into a topic that every nurse and doctor and patient should understand when medical mistakes cross into criminal law. What happens when a patient is seriously harmed or even dies because of medical error? Where is the line between human mistakes and criminal negligence? Joining me today is Colin McKellen, a criminal law expert who has handled cases involving healthcare professionals and patient harm. Together, we'll explore the legal realities nurses and doctors face, the rights of patients and families, and how we can all learn to protect ourselves and each other through education, communication, and accountability. This episode isn't about fear, it's about empowerment, because understanding the law is part of understanding healthcare. Well, thanks, Colin. Thanks so much for being on Go Ask a Nurse. I am so excited to dive into this conversation with you about legalities of medicine.
My
So
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
tell us a little bit about what you do, what you've been doing this last 20 years and
Yeah. Well, for 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 your listeners, I've known Anna Marie for a long time. We went to college together. We went to Creighton University, and after we graduated, I moved back to Denver. That's where I'm from, and went to law school here at the University of Denver, and have been practicing criminal law ever since I graduated law school in 2003. So I've been a lawyer now for 22 years, which is pretty amazing when you say it like that, but it's been 22 years. I started out as a prosecutor. I was a deputy district attorney here in Colorado for about 6 years, prosecuted everything from DUI cases to homicide cases, and switched sides in 2008 and became a criminal defense attorney. And that is what I have been doing ever since. So I represent people who are charged with just about any crime across the spectrum. And that's what I've been doing for a long time. I am also the host of a podcast. I have a podcast called Is This Legal? And it's just kind of a legal podcast that I do with my law partner, and we talk about issues going on in the world related to the law or true crime, stuff like that.
which is so fun
Yeah,
to listen to. So for all you listeners that really are like listen to what's going on in the country, it is really fun to listen to.
thank you.
As myself, I've been a nurse, and one of the big things about my podcast is to focus on medical issues and
Hmm.
meet with a lot of medical experts. And one of the biggest
Absolutely.
things in our practice in medicine is you see probably like a lot of lawsuits. A lot of things have gone wrong.
Hmm.
Working in the OR, and then actually, as we're older, we see our parents getting older, and then you think about elderly abuse. So there's so many other things that I didn't imagine or think about before, and now I think about so much more of that now. But the legalities of a lot of areas, I'm sure you see.
Oh yeah. And I really appreciate you having me on, because in my practice, there is some intersection that I have with various medical professionals. Depending on what kind of case I'm working on. Obviously, if I'm working on a case where someone was injured, oftentimes nurses are going to be witnesses to those crimes. Cases like domestic violence, for example, nurses are often unwitting witnesses because they're treating a person who has been abused by their partner. That's certainly an area where I see it. Certainly, I think nurses, just talking about your profession, in the way I see it more from afar. I mean, I think nurses have one of the most difficult jobs you can think of. I mean, you guys are kind of in the middle of all of it. You're dealing with patients. You probably have a lot more patient care time than physicians or other medical professionals, and because of that, you also, to a certain extent, may have accountability if things go wrong with that patient, with their treatment, or if some other staff member did something but it wasn't properly documented, that can fall on you. There's a lot of ways where nurses in their profession can can find themselves in a very difficult situation to navigate. So that I think legally, just from my perspective, nurses have so many different things going on at one time that they always have to navigate. And certainly that can lead to sometimes legal exposure, whether it's malpractice or sometimes, depending on a complaint, it can be criminal. So yeah, I do see some stuff in my line of work, with nurses just as witnesses, but also nurses who find themselves in this weird, unfortunate situation where maybe they're investigated for something, or being sued by somebody, and that's a scary place to be.
Yeah, can we kind of talk about that a little bit? Like, what's the difference between criminal negligence and medical malpractice?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like, if you are a caregiver, whether it be a physician or a nurse, and something goes wrong with a patient in your care, what can then happen? Well, Anna Marie, as you just said, you kind of talked about both. You have the civil arena and the criminal arena. In the civil arena, we talk about medical malpractice. That's where a person can be sued monetarily for what happened. And generally speaking, when nurses are acting in good faith in accord with the directives of the physician, generally speaking, they're going to be pretty well protected. I'm sure, just being around hospitals, I'm so aware of the documentation and levels of, I guess, data entry that nurses just have to do on a daily basis just to show what they've done for a particular patient. In some ways, I think those protect the patient, or pardon me, protect the nurse rather, from future litigation should something go wrong, because you can say, okay, look, these are all the steps. I followed all the protocol. I followed all these things, and if you're showing a clear flow of communication and care, you're probably going to be protected. Now, that's the civil malpractice side. What about the criminal side? That is much more rare, where a nurse is going to be charged criminally for care gone wrong. I mean, I'll tell you right now, Anna Marie, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't think I have ever heard of, say, example, an ER physician or nurse, or even like a nurse oncologist or something like that, where a patient dies in their care and they are charged criminally for negligence. That's a pretty rare thing. There would have to be something really, really egregious with the care. Although, honestly, Anna Marie, in terms of what makes a difference between malpractice and a criminal negligence, those things are kind of defined the same. Negligence is negligence, which is essentially carelessness. If you abandon your duty of care to a patient to a degree that you cause them harm, that can be negligence. But obviously, those are two very different ways that it could be dealt with.
I guess, something I was just thinking about that came to my mind is people who go in and get treatment, cancer treatment, dialysis. I'm just thinking surgery, are doing something. Okay, if you go in for a procedure, you're not supposed to be behind the wheel. That is
Sure.
stated. After cancer treatments, I would have to look that up on what the protocol is for after, if they can drive or if they cannot drive. But in the case that they were to get in a car accident or something was to
Hmm.
happen, who's held responsible in the
Yeah, no,
situation?
that's a great question. Um, Fortunately, I think in that specific type of scenario, I would like to think that the nurse doesn't have as much of exposure as maybe the hospital would, the facility. And, I can tell you, most plaintiffs' lawyers are not really interested in going after a nurse, who, I mean, frankly, if they're going to get compensated, they want to go after an insurance company, or they want to go after someone that has deep pockets that can compensate them. They typically don't want to name nurses individually and go after them, because you're talking about trying to squeeze money from a turnip. It doesn't work. So I think in that scenario, it could. I think there could be liability on the hospital, maybe even the nurse, but probably I got to think the nurse is probably not going to be targeted in that situation too badly.
You were talking about, our charting and everything that we do on a daily basis.
Oh man.
So here's some thoughts too. As nurses, can I see a lot of false documentation saying that they're doing something and they're not doing it.
Hmm.
Nurses who are supposed to do dressing changes that patients that have wounds, are they doing it to the extent that they're supposed to? And is this wound worsening because the nurse has not been doing the right cares, the
Well,
daily?
and you're talking, the interesting thing about the population that you're talking about that's receiving care are obviously extremely sick people or extremely old people or both. The type of patient who can't always advocate for themselves. And I'm sorry to say, sometimes the type of patient that you encounter abuse in the form of, is this nurse actually, not only not providing care, but in their neglect, or is this person being abused? Unfortunately, that is something that I sometimes see in my practice because you're dealing with vulnerable patients who just aren't in the best position to advocate for themselves. And so, yes, of course, that's going to be something that is just going to happen when you're treating patients. There's always going to be a few bad apples or a few people who don't take the care as seriously as maybe they should. And yeah, the thing about it though, Anna Marie, is that I guess again, the nice thing about documentation, the nice thing about charting, although I'm sure it's the subject of, probably the top five annoying thing that a nurse has to do, it does protect you, and if you put in an entry that's not true, that's later found out to be not true, it can also affect you. It can also, hurt you. And that protects the patient. So, this is one of those areas where, I think that over documentation is sometimes something that is your best friend as a nurse. It's not just, it might not be a geriatric patient, it might just be a difficult patient, Anna Marie. I mean, you guys know these folks, mentally ill folks, people who are in withdrawal due to from whatever drug they were on. Some people just aren't very nice to their healthcare providers, and you as a nurse might be tempted to respond in a particular way, but you can't do that. You can't respond to that provocation. If anything, you have to go the other way and double down and document all of your efforts. I'm sure hospitals and nursing managers across the country have their own product protocol for dealing with difficult patients, but you go in with a witness. You have another nurse go in with you to check on that patient. Or you say, hey, fellow nurse, I just saw this guy. This is what he said to me. Why don't you go talk to him, see if you say the same thing? You're creating a record by doing that. You're helping yourself say, okay, it's not just going to be my word against, you almost have to think. And of course, this is the jaded lawyer talking, but sometimes, unfortunately, you nurses, with the patient care that you have on a daily basis, you almost have to think, okay, 6 months down the road, could this person possibly sue me for anything? Can I back up everything, every single thing that I did caring for this patient? Did I forget something? Did I miss something? And obviously, this is true for any profession. You want to make sure that you're doing your best to protect yourself, but nurses are vulnerable to these kinds of complaints, and you never know from what left field they're going to come from.
What kind of cases have you dealt with when it comes to nurses being charged and accused?
So a few different categories actually. And this isn't necessarily well. Some of these are common to all professions. Some of them are more impactful for nurses. I have represented folks who have worked in nursing homes, for example, who are accused of abusing or neglecting a patient. And I'll tell you, those cases are really, really tricky, really tricky. I don't want to reveal too much client info in a case that I handled, but it was several years ago. And the allegation was that this person had been neglecting a 95-year-old woman, and this woman wasn't really in a very, she wasn't very articulate. She had flights of consciousness where she was able to speak clearly, other times where she wasn't really able to be understood. And, I'm representing a person who's saying, look, I don't know what's going on here, but this isn't true. That can be the type of case where I've represented a person. I've represented, there's been situations, again, this is, I think, a little bit more rare, but beware of any patient that offers you any sort of financial gift or entanglement that you choose to accept. Okay. This is, I saw a situation where a nurse had been gifted Bronco tickets, Denver Bronco tickets. And one of her family members complained later and said, "Oh, the nurse must have pressured this patient into giving up these tickets." It was really, really silly, but it merited this nurse giving a phone call to me saying, "Oh my gosh, I think I'm being investigated for taking advantage of an elderly person by accepting Bronco tickets." And again, that ended up being a nothing burger, but this is just these are a couple situations off the top of my head where you got nurses who find themselves in this bizarre situation that they didn't ask for.
So, in those situations, though, that you would advise them not to accept any kind of gifts or any
Yeah,
compensation.
well, you just want to know who you're dealing with. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't really you don't find out who a patient is until after they leave your care, and you just want to be in a position where you can't be accused of anything. And your job is to treat that patient, give them the best possible care you can in the moment, and essentially move on. You know, and so I think that just the way to protect yourself is just to keep the relationship that you have with any patient, nurse patient, professional. And that's another way you can protect yourself. Again, document, 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 witnesses help. Hey, I just went in and saw this patient. He was extremely volatile. He called me X amount of names. All those things should be documented. I think a lot of nurses too, you guys are so used to this, like ER nurses or people who work with people who are coming off of mental illness or drug withdrawal, the really tough populations. Oftentimes nurses face all kind of abuses and they don't document them. And maybe that patient comes back later with a complaint and that nurse says, "Oh, well, this person called me, an effing a-hole, and but you didn't document it at the time." And so now you're in a position where you're playing defense on a case where if you just taken the time to chart exactly what the person said, you might be able to protect yourself. Things like that. Nurses are pretty good, I think, in a lot of cases. This is true with doctors, probably lawyers. You can kind of spot those people. If you see those people and they're just going to be a little bit more high maintenance patients, you have to treat them that way, and you have to treat your file that way. But yeah, you just have to be really smart. You have to think, okay, what could this person possibly sue me for? It's a shame though that we have to think in those terms, but sometimes you do.
So, in those situations, you know that maybe an interaction initially, and you kind of have that feeling. Um, can nurses record? I
Oh
know with
yes.
their phones, can that be used?
Well, yes and no. Certainly, if the anything related to medical history, anything related to treatment plan, things like that, that might be confidential. But if you, for example, are an ER nurse and you have a person who you're treating that is literally threatening you with harm, or when I get out of these restraints, I'm gonna, effing kill you. ER nurses, I know they hear all this stuff all the time. Yes, you can record that because that's not privileged, protected information. That's not information related to healthcare. That's related to the interaction that you're having with the patient. Okay. Now, in any case, obviously, if you're disclosing a recorded statement from a patient, that the patient might have their own view on whether or not that's HIPAA protected. So you certainly wouldn't want to disclose that information. You'd want to tell your supervisor about it. You want to say, "Hey, I documented this. I recorded the interaction of him saying these horrible things to me, and I want to preserve this just in case something comes of it later. So yeah, I mean, talk about a tough road to navigate because you're a nurse, you got to protect confidentiality, but not at the expense of, you know, you receiving abuse or, verbal condemnation. You can protect yourself from that.
Well, because you think about it, it's honestly your word against theirs. And as a patient, they probably get looked at, oh, they're the patient. The nurse is causing harm to them when they're really causing the harm to the medical
Oh
people
yeah.
that are providing it. And so,
A- Absolutely. And, certainly there are situations. I mean, I think nurses do get protected too. I mean, as a criminal defense lawyer, I've seen the other end of it too, where I've seen patients get charged for assaulting nurses or kicking at them or for crossing a line. And certainly, like, if you actually, I'm from the state of Colorado, that's where I practice. If you commit a crime against a healthcare worker, um, it's actually a felony. It gets upgraded to a felony, even if it were just a misdemeanor offense without the person being a healthcare worker. So certainly, healthcare workers, nurses are protected in those senses. But you guys have to be de-escalators as part of your job, and I'm sorry that kind of comes with the territory, but it really is. This is part of your job is to step in and calm a person down that may be upset with you for no reason, for no reason whatsoever. But as a de-escalator, that's how you get the person to calm down and hopefully fend off a lot of these things before they happen.
absolutely. I'm just in my mind, I just have I'm envisioning in some encounters I've had where, I've had to de-escalate and, they start putting their fist together and you're like, I think twice about that one.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And those are dangerous situations because it's always a shame when nurses kind of have to be asked to do more than what you're really supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be providing patient care and caring for people who are sick and injured, but often it turns into being a little bit of a security guard and having to, calm down a very upset person who doesn't want to be treated, that doesn't want to be in your presence. You have to get that person to calm down and so that you can actually do your job and treat them. And way easier said than done. And like I said, because it's not said enough, nurses have one of the toughest job in the country, and they don't get recognized for it enough, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. I, you know, um, some of the patients we get because I deal with TBIs as
Oh
well.
yeah.
So they can't help it. They really don't know what they're doing. They're frustrated. Um, that's where the de-escalation really helps and being patient with them, but some of them are just over the top.
I mean, anytime you're dealing with a person who has some sort of mental health issue, whether TBI, that's a good one. And the funny thing about a TBI, of course, as you know, is it can present in so many different ways, right? A person might have very mild symptoms where you're like, okay, person's not totally there, but he's able to understand what I'm talking about versus an extreme case, you know, um, and having to have to de-escalate a person and that isn't able to process what you're saying, isn't able to do that obviously is a very difficult situation, and nurses do it every day.
What are some real examples where a nurse or a doctor has faced a criminal charges for a patient's harm or death?
Kind of like we were talking earlier, it would really have to be something egregious. I think that there is enough acceptance in the world that if a patient voluntarily, I mean, sometimes it's not voluntarily, but if you go and receive medical care of any kind, certainly surgery, but really kind of any medical care, there might be risks that are associated with that care. And even when things go wrong, all right, if there's an infection that comes after the surgery, or even if the surgeon made a mistake during the surgery, the law and malpractice in general is fairly forgiving, in my opinion, um, and more interested in, okay, well, we're not going to ruin this doctor's life or this nurse's life. Let's work things out to the courts through insurance and make sure it never happens again, and everybody move on. Everybody can make a mistake. It in order for it to become like criminal, it would have to be really, really bad. Like, you're talking about maybe a doctor or a nurse who's under the influence of a drug or alcohol or something when they shouldn't be, and they're operating on a patient, something like that. I mean, clearly that's going to be illegal. Really any type of care, that's alleged to be under the influence or something like that can be an issue. Um, if the again, if the error is just reckless in nature, they could be criminally responsible. But I those cases are very few and far between. Again, uh, I've seen some situations again where, kind of like we were talking about earlier, if there's any sort of weird financial entanglement between the patient and the nurse or the doctor, that can sometimes go south. But really, you're mostly going to be on the civil side of things, which is where you want to be if faced with this being in this arena, as opposed to the criminal side, if you make a mistake or an error. But again, disclosure, documentation, just good record keeping practices are going to be your helper on all this stuff. You see your boss, your employer, the source of your livelihood doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to report them. Yeah, that's a tough one, and I think it always come down to, you educate yourself if you're in that position. You can always, there's people that you can reach out to. You can reach out to, uh, and I'm wondering, Anna Marie, you might know more about this. Here's something I can tell you: if there's a situation where I, as a lawyer, am faced with an immediate ethical issue, involving either an active client or someone who's contacted me, we in Colorado, we have this hotline I can call, and I can contact an ethics attorney. They actually have these folks on call, and I can lay out the situation for them, and I can say, what should I do? It's anonymous. I don't have, I can provide as much info as I want, and I don't have to disclose that conversation to anybody. I don't know, I really don't, if nurses have the ability to contact someone like that, but I would think there might be something they could do, where if you're in that situation, and obviously it's sensitive and you don't want to bring it to the attention of your employer yet, you might be able to reach out to, like, a nurse's ethical hotline, and say, okay, this is the situation I'm in. What should I do? What should I document? Who should I talk to? Should I tell the patient? Because frankly, you and I know that that kind of behavior it's suspicious and should be questioned. You're putting a person, you're anesthetizing a patient, and you want all the staff to leave. That's that's not transparent. That's probably weird. And if your red flag is going up on that, you should maybe consider following up on it. But yeah, that's a tricky one for sure.
Legally, like if you get fired for that, are you able to take legal action?
I would think so. I mean, that sounds like retaliatory, uh, firing. And yeah, while I don't have a background in employment law, yeah, if generally speaking, you can't fire someone because you realize they're about to blow the whistle on you, for exposing criminal or fraudulent behavior. So yeah, that not a good practice, in that situation, to let your staff go, for that reason, because I don't think it's warranted. And yeah, you might have an action against your employer if that happens.
You
I
always
hope it doesn't happen. Hmm.
you always, wonder how many people stay quiet for that reason
Oh
of
yeah,
retaliation.
of
Um,
course. Yeah, I mean, let's face it. How many times a day? Well, maybe not a day, but maybe a week. Does a nurse have to say, "Oh my gosh, I wish I didn't see the thing that I just saw"? And it's probably, I would guess, in those situations, and you nurses who are listening, you can probably think of them right now. It's probably easier and more convenient to not say anything. It's probably easier to just ignore whatever you saw and move on with your shift because that keeps you employed and keeps you moving on with your life. So those things are always tough to deal with, but you're not alone. And there's people that you can reach out to when you're faced with those situations, and you should, especially if you're unsure to act, because, again, the more people that you reach out to, the more you can document, the more it shows that you care.
I'll have to get that information on for the state of Nebraska. I'm sure each state probably has their own hotline of who to contact.
Yeah.
So that's some really good information. Um,
I mean, I can always honestly say, if you're ever in that situation, don't know who to turn to, call a lawyer, you know, just talk to someone where you can have a confidential conversation. And hopefully that can assist those sticky situations.
how do prosecutors decide when to file criminal charges against a healthcare provider?
So prosecutors typically operate in a couple different ways. They can use what they call a grand jury. Some states use this where they convene a large body of people and they present the facts of the case, that allows them, or where they think they have probable cause to charge someone. And the grand jury, if they decide that there's probable cause for that crime to go forward, they will issue what they call a true bill, and the person gets charged. That's one way it can happen. The other way it can happen is the prosecutor generally has direct filing capability. They can just bring charges themselves if they believe that they have probable cause that a crime is committed. Now, that's generally how it works. In the more specific, Anna Marie, it really kind of comes down to a case by case basis. In a case, for example, where a nurse is accused of neglect or abuse of their patient, well, um, there might be some evidence of abuse, but is it enough for a prosecutor to prove the abuse beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the criminal standard of proof. That's the burden of proof that the prosecutor has to meet in that case. And, I've seen situations where they're like, gosh, you know what? We think something happened here, but we can't prove it. Maybe because the patient who's alleging it, again, for reasons we talked about, maybe due to age or just their incapacitation due to whatever they're suffering with, they can't make good witnesses and say what happened in court. So it really comes down to a case by case basis. But I think there, if there's any focus on in the criminal justice system on nurses, it's is there abuse? Is there any allegation that this nurse is doing harm to a patient? And fortunately, those cases are pretty few and far between. So, but yeah, those are a couple of ways that a prosecutor can move forward with cases. They'll be brought to them by the. Of course, it always starts with a police investigation, and the prosecutor decides how to handle it from there.
That is, when you think about it, for those people who work in long-term care facilities or the Alzheimer's unit, and well, I mean, patients could be just living independently, but the older population and they start declining and then they start maybe making up stories or thinking or assuming things are happening and they're not. And that becomes a little sticky because here they're telling their family members, oh, my nurse isn't doing this for me or doing that, or they're looking at things from a different
Mm-hmm.
light than what's really happening.
That's where problems can arise. I mean, often maybe the disclosure of what happened. Let's say there's an allegation again that a nurse is abusing, say, an elder patient in a nursing home. Um, maybe the allegation is born from the patient telling a family member, "Hey, so and so was mean to me earlier today." And there's no context as to what that meant, but the family member is very protected and wants to make sure that didn't happen, so they raise an allegation. And it's like, well, what information do we have? What can we prove? What can't we prove? These are things that we have to contend with all the time. And again, fortunately, it doesn't happen terribly often, but we do have to deal with it.
What should a nurse do immediately if they make a mistake that could have harmed a patient?
I think what I'm going to say is not a surprise. I think if you make a mistake as a nurse, I think the best thing to do, probably in any profession, in most professions, is to own up to it immediately, document it, tell somebody. The minute that you try and cover it up, the minute you try and sweep it under the rug, I mean, that, first of all, not only is that bad practice, not only could that be malpractice, but then we're talking about criminal stuff, right? That's when we're actually talking about knowingly taking action to perpetrate a fraud against a patient or against a hospital, which can be criminal. So, look, kind of like what I said, the medical system, for better or for worse, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but it is designed to compensate people who have been harmed, during the care that they receive in a hospital or by medical professionals. And while ultimately, if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. It's going to be okay. But the biggest mistake you can make is to pretend that you didn't make a mistake or to deny that you made a mistake and cover it up. I'm telling you, the cover up is always worse than the crime, right? I'm telling you, I wish I could tell you how many times I've said that in my career. It's always true. So if you make a mistake, come forward. You will have support, and I think that's the best practice.
Absolutely. Can a nurse or a doctor be criminally charged even if there was no intent to harm?
So yeah, in criminal law, in my world, in order to be charged with a crime, there's actually two elements that have to be proven. And if I'm going to get a little law school professorial on everybody, we'll use some Latin. You have to prove the actus reus and you have to prove the mens rea. Okay. So the actus reus is the actual act. Okay. What was there a crime? Um, but what you're talking about, Anne Marie, is the mens rea, the mental aspect. Was there intent to commit a crime, and what was the intent required to prove? So both of those things have to be proven in order for a person to be convicted of a crime. It's not enough to prove that they acted. You have to show that they actually intended to act the way that they did, that it wasn't a mistake, for example. So again, kind of a case by case basis, but the classic mens rea for crimes that we deal with traditionally is, if does a person act knowingly? Okay, if a person, that's the highest threshold, with intent or knowingly. The next tier is, did they act recklessly? Okay, maybe the district attorney can't prove that the bad actor acted with intent, but they were reckless in their actions. Okay. Then below recklessness is carelessness, like we talked about. That's the negligence standard. That's we made a mistake in this person's care. And it's still a violation of their care, but it's the least egregious and the one that's probably the most protected. So those are the tiers of criminal liability that the police and district attorneys look at if they're evaluating whether or not a nurse committed a crime.
What common documentation mistakes end up being used against healthcare providers in court?
I think it's the situation where you just didn't document enough. Maybe it's the end of your 12-hour shift and you just finished dealing with the difficult patient and you're just like, you know what, I'm going to finish this chart later. Or you just kind of fill out a bare bones thing that didn't include everything. I think it's omissions. If you omit things in your report that happened that are relevant to the care that was given to the patient, that can always be an issue. So I think over documentation, over disclosure, if you're not sure to put it in the chart or not, put it in. That kind of thing is generally going to be a good way to help you out. But yeah, you just want to make sure that you are doing the best you can to be thorough, so that, because remember, it's a shame that we have to live like this, but you have to think, okay, if is something that I've done today, is there, have I done anything that could cause a patient to come after me in some way in the future? And if the answer to that is no, you're doing everything right.
So, if a patient dies unexpectedly, what steps should medical staff take to protect themselves legally, while also being transparent?
I think it that is just right along with what we've been saying. Oh my gosh, the patient died. Here's what happened. Here's what we know. Here's what we previously put in the chart notes, and you make yourself available for anything that needs to be answered with regard to any investigation after the fact. Um, Full transparency, full disclosure. If you're in that situation and you haven't been asked to write a statement yet, you might want to consider just writing out your own narrative immediately when it's fresh in your memory. It's not something that you want to be thinking about doing a couple weeks later. You want to get everything down fresh in your mind. You can dictate it if that's easier. Uh, Basically, just preserve the information as much as possible to protect yourself.
So when should a nurse or provider contact legal counsel before giving a statement? Should they do it before they give a statement?
Yeah, I mean, I tell anybody, first of all, as a criminal defense attorney, I always tell people if you're ever contacted by the police, you do not have to talk to the police. You literally don't. It's right there in the Fifth Amendment. And if you don't know why the police are calling you, or they're telling you flat out that they're investigating you for a crime, your response to them should be, listen, I'm not making any statements. I want to talk to a lawyer. That's the safest course of action, even if you have no idea why they're calling you. A lot of people make the assumption, and it seems like a fair assumption to make. Okay, if I haven't done anything wrong, why wouldn't I exercise my Fifth Amendment right or waive my Fifth Amendment right and talk to the police and give a full account of what happened? And here's the problem: is by the time they're coming to the person that they're investigating, they've already talked to other people. They've already done their own investigation. And you, as the person making a statement, you don't have the knowledge that the police do. You don't know what's been said. You don't know how their investigation's been framed. And they could have been provided and maybe acting on false or embellished information. You don't want to offer a statement that might contradict what they say because then they might think that you're being dishonest. You always want to say, look, you want to protect yourself. I'm not making any statement. So if it's a police officer, that's the simple one. That's when you know it might be criminal. You say, I'm not making any statement without an attorney. Um, Apart from that, though, if you are in a situation where you just feel trapped, where you're like, okay, I've either witnessed something that maybe don't think I should have witnessed, but I have to disclose it, or you're in that position, I have, I've come across information I don't know what to do with it. Do something. Call somebody. Call a lawyer. Call an ethical hotline. See if you can get some answers. Don't just ignore the problem.
Like, how do courts handle cases where systemic hospital failures, like understaffing or broken equipment, contributed to a patient's death? Like, have you dealt a lot with
Yeah,
that?
I have not. So I would really be speculating. That is a good question though, because when you think about it, the care that you might receive, say, like in New York City, might be different than the care you receive if you have a medical, emergency. I don't know, in Fort Worth, Texas, in the middle of a highway. Like if those two patients are taken to the hospital and one of them dies and one of them lives, does it mean that that we should sue one of them or that one of them underperformed? That's a tough question. It's always dependent on resources and availability and all that stuff. I think it really comes down to at the end, was there uh, should the hospital have been in a position to do better? Should they have known that you talked about systemic failure? Should they have known that any lack of equipment or lack of proper medical technology, if that's causing patients to die on the table, there might be an action against them for causing a pattern of these types of injuries. But again, um, I think that there would have to be something pretty egregious to be shown for that to be the case. I think simple negligence is generally, I hate the word that you use accepted, but it is. There's an understanding that people made mistakes and that they might have issues with the care that they receive.
How can healthcare professionals advocate for safer systems without fearing retaliation or legal risk?
I'll tell you, I don't really think. I mean, to me, you should always be in a position where you can advocate for better working conditions. And if best practices, as the field of medicine and nursing move on, require changes to be made, that comes from the frontline folks like nurses. So I think that there's strength in numbers. I think that when nurses get together and have good ideas and want to inform policy, I think people should listen up. Obviously, you got to be respectful and um, in terms of how you communicate those things. But um, I think that you should be your own advocate as a nurse for what you think is right and for what you think is going to make you a better caregiver for your patients.
Is there anything that you want to share or encourage nurses or healthcare workers out there about how to protect themselves?
Yeah, I do. I mean, again, the nursing field has my full admiration. I think that nurses, the things that you guys see and have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's amazing work and it's hard work and it's underappreciated work. My advice to those nurses out there is to make sure that you guys are taking care of yourselves because you guys are caregivers. You guys have to be on your feet for long hours and long days that have very emotional highs and lows. You're literally dealing with pain and suffering and death, and that stuff will wash over you. And you have to make sure that you're taking care of yourselves. You have to make sure that you're using your time off well, that you're being well rested, that you're taking care of yourself physically and mentally. And there are resources for nurses out there. Obviously, sometimes nurses can be susceptible to things like depression, substance abuse, things like that, just based on coping with the things that you see every day. Reach out for help. Okay, there are organizations in place that specifically help nurses cope with their livelihood, and you should take full advantage of those things. So if you can't care for yourself, then you can't care effectively for other people. That's what you always have to remember. But I just appreciate all of the nurses out there. I think it's great that you have this podcast where like-minded folks can get together and talk because nursing is, boy, is it important.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise. I can imagine everything that you see as well. So you definitely understand mental health,
Yes,
how important it is. And so thank you so much for coming on. This was
no problem.
fun.
It's my pleasure. And yeah, it's an honor. Thank you for having me.
Healthcare professionals dedicate their lives to helping others, but even in the most caring hands, mistakes can happen. What matters most is how we respond with honesty, integrity, and the courage to keep learning. A huge thank you to the attorney Colin McCollin for sharing valuable insights today. If you're a nurse, doctor, or healthcare worker, remember, knowing your rights is part of protecting your patients. And to our listeners, if this conversation moved you, share this episode with someone in healthcare. Let's keep the dialogue open and make accountability and compassion part of the same story. You can find more episodes at goaskanurse.com, and don't forget to follow Go Ask a Nurse on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And don't forget to check out Colin's podcast called Is This Legal? I will link it below on my website. Until next time, ask questions, know your care, and empower your health. And be blessed. The information provided on this podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard on this podcast. The views expressed by guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Go Ask a Nurse.